It reminds me of 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 19, which says, "Do not quench the Spirit." How do you quench the Spirit in your life? You don't cooperate with the Lord in the midst of trials. You don't let it make you better. You become instead what? Bitter. And to be frank with you, I would say this: 75 to 80% of American Christians are just right there. Because they've been taught a version of Christianity where Christianity is kind of a life of ease and prosperity, a life of self-empowerment. And when they hit an adversity, they think God has cheated them because they've been mistaught. Or they're just angry at God because how could God allow this to happen? And they close down the process. They don't let patience have its work. And they stay in the same place of immaturity for decades. And then God tries to get their attention again by putting them into another problem, and they have the same result. And they don't get closer to God, they get further away from God. I think that's what it means when it says, "Do not quench the Spirit." It has to do with how we're going to react in the midst of adversity. You, to a large extent, can't control the adversity that comes into your life unless you bring it on yourself through dumb decisions. But that's not what James is talking about here. He's talking about adversity beyond our control. These people had been kicked out of their land, kicked out of their homes. They're living in the diaspora. They didn't ask for this, but that's what happened to them. And they have no control over the adversity that just happened to them. But here's what you can control. You can control your reaction to the adversity. That's totally within your control. And that determines whether you're going to be a growing Christian. How you respond to it determines whether you're going to be a growing Christian or a stagnant Christian. So let patience have its perfect work, because that in turn is going to put you into a situation so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The Greek there for complete or lacking in nothing is teleos, which means the end. It doesn't mean sinless. It means you sin less. It means you're growing up. You're maturing. You're no longer sucking your thumb. You're out of the diapers. You're actually, like we did with our daughter when she was just learning to walk. She obviously, as a toddler, can't walk without parental support, but now how exciting it is when she's walking on her own. So that's what it means, teleos, maturity, lacking in nothing. We're on the road to growth here. So that's what happens when we allow trials to have the work that God wants to do in us through those trials. Patience is developed, verse 3. Maturity starts to be developed, verse 4. And that's why James, verse 2 says, when you hit the trial, rejoice, because look at what God's going to do through it. You're going to become a more patient person than you were last year because of your trial in 2020. And you're going to become a more mature, spiritually speaking, person than you were last year because of your trial in 2020. So James says, rejoice. Now, this is the problem with drugs. This is why our society is hooked on drugs. Even if I'm not a medical doctor, but even many so-called prescription drugs that people are on, alcohol, all of these kinds of things, what are they trying to do? They're trying to numb the pain. They're trying to pretend like the pain is not there by injecting or ingesting or drinking or whatever, some sort of substance into them which numbs the pain. And so as they're numbing the pain, what is happening? All those years of maturity are forfeited. Because God uses the pain to bring us to maturity. So if you get yourself involved with something that denies the pain or numbs you up where the pain doesn't exist, then all those years of maturity where you could have been maturing are forfeited. See that? That's why when you talk to people, I know people, even going back to high school, that were on drugs and things like that all of the time. You talk to them today, and they're basically like emotional infants because they've forfeited all of those years of growth, which they could have had. And I'm not here to give medical advice about what drugs legally people should be on or not. I'm just saying, think about it. When you're living in a culture that's saying, take this pill, take this shot, the goal would be to numb the pain. Well, who ever said that all pain is bad? I mean, obviously, God can use pain, and here I'm primarily talking about emotional pain, to take us to the next level of faith. So, gee, Pastor Andy, I sure don't think like this. I sure don't rejoice in the midst of my trials. So what should I do? How in the world do I get myself into a position where I have the mind of God that you're describing in the midst of trials? Because I don't have it naturally. Well, I'm so glad you asked, because James tells you exactly how to get it. What does he say in verse 5? But if any of you lacks wisdom, what wisdom? The mind of God on trials. I don't have the mind of God on trials. I don't react with rejoicing in the midst of trials. So how do I get the divine perspective? James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask who? Your counselor? No. Dr. Phil? No. Let him ask who? Let him ask God. Now, isn't that interesting? How we'll go and talk to everybody and anybody about our problems except the Lord, when it's only the Lord that can give us the right perspective on problems. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. Now, is God really going to give wisdom to little old me? Well, look at the rest of verse 5. Who gives to all generously. Wow. Without reproach, and it will be given to him. So if readers lack this perspective, they should ask in faith of God, and he will give them his point of view on trials. Now, is God in the wisdom business? I mean, if you ask God for wisdom on something, is God the type of God that answers that request? Well, you don't have to look far in the Bible to see that God gives wisdom beyond our abilities to many people. Remember what he did for Solomon? 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night and said, ask what you wish me to give to you. Now, how would you like that dream? How would you like God to show up at a dream tonight in your mind and say, ask whatever you want and I'll give it to you? That's in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. So what does Solomon ask for? Verse 9. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people and discern between good and evil. So Solomon had become the third king of the United Kingdom. He reigned for 40 years. He was probably very young at this point in his tenure. And he said, well, the only thing I really want from you, Lord, is I just want wisdom on how to be a king. I mean, how do I do the job? And so God answers verse 12, 1 Kings 3, behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given to you a wise and discerning heart, so that no one like you before you, nor shall one be like after you will arise after you. In other words, you're going to be unique, Solomon. I'm going to give you wisdom. Hey, that's why Solomon authored 3 books of the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon first, Proverbs second, Ecclesiastes third. Why would Solomon write 3 books of the Old Testament? Because God gave him wisdom. Solomon was involved in many poems and proverbs, and he was involved in zoology and botany and all kinds of literature. Why? Because he asked God for wisdom. And then God says this, I have also given you what you have not asked for. See, Solomon could have asked for riches and honor. He could have asked for the death of his enemies. Solomon never asked for any of that. He just said, give me wisdom so I can govern your people. And God says, not only am I going to answer that request, but I'm going to answer all of the other requests that you never asked for. I have given you what you asked, 1 Kings 3:13, both riches and honor, so there will not be any among you, the kings like you in all your days. So you read a story like that and you say, wow, God is in the wisdom business. God wants to give wisdom. Now, in this context, it's dealing with wisdom in trials. There's a specific context here. But I believe that almost any matter you inquire of God of, as is true in the case of Solomon, God will give you his wisdom if you really want it on that matter.